Welcome to this webinar for the Researching Creative Economies in Africa seminar series. My name is Dr. Lauren England from King's College London, and I'll be chairing today's seminar with Dr. Madinatu Bello from the University of Cape Coast, Ghana. Dr. Bello will present a discussion on the significance of gender inclusivity in Ghana's Indigenous drumming traditions. Her research highlights the barriers that women face in participating in drumming activities, accessing leadership roles, and receiving proper training due to long-standing patriarchal traditions. The seminar aims to spark a discussion on rethinking cultural policy to promote more inclusive, regenerative cultural practices. Dr. Madinatu Bello lectures on performing arts at the Department of Theatre and Film Studies, University of Cape Coast, Ghana. She reads arts management, theatre for development, and music education. She is a DAAD alumna and a fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, the African Humanities Programme, and African Peacebuilding Network Next Generation in Africa. Thank you very much, Dr. Madinatu Bello.
Good morning. I'm Madinatu Bello from the University of Cape Coast Department of Theatre and Film Studies, and today I'm presenting on the topic Gender and Cultural Regeneration in Indigenous Drumming Practices in Ghana towards a gender-inclusive regenerative cultural policy. Gender inclusivity in Indigenous drumming in Ghana is not just a matter of justice. It is a structural prerequisite for authentic cultural regeneration. That's because drumming serves as a fundamental medium through which social hierarchies, spiritual power, and communal memory are expressed, but the systematic and continuous marginalization of women in most components of the performance both reflects and perpetuates broader gender inequities within Ghanaian society. And to advance from minimal sustainability to a regenerative cultural policy, I think it is essential to transform the gendered logics embedded in both state frameworks and everyday drumming practices, ensuring that all genders can fully participate in creating, leading, transmitting, and governing cultural activities. Indigenous drumming in Ghana uses crafted drums in ritual, spiritual, and social contexts, which form a foundational aspect of community and social life, as well as cultural identity. Historically, however, access to prestigious roles such as lead drummer, master drummer, ensemble ownership, and even ritual specialist has been predominantly reserved for men. In contrast, women have been mostly relegated to secondary roles such as clapping, singing, dancing, or occasionally playing supporting instruments, not the master or lead drum. And that experiences have been with me since infancy, where I participate in normal everyday events, and I realize that more often than not, they are the males who are drumming and the females are dancing, clapping and singing alongside the drumming. This division is further reinforced by a sacred secular split, where men may perform in both sacred and secular spaces, while women are typically confined to secular performances and explicitly excluded from shrines and other spiritually significant areas due to beliefs surrounding menstruations or ritual inappropriateness. And I think that these are more like social controls that are used to actually perpetuate this kind of injustices against women. These exclusions create significant constraints on women's training, visibility, leadership, and recognition. Male drummers are systematically given priority in assessing instruments, rehearsal spaces, and instruction, while women often report being barred from playing lead drums or being compelled to switch to lighter instruments such as bells or maracas, even when they demonstrate competence. And I saw a lot of them when I was on the field, actually, with some women, interviewing them and even watching their performances. Consequently, women who have and are achieving higher level levels of expertise within the past 5 decades appear to remain rare, often overlooked, denied formal titles like master drama, leadership roles, or compensation equivalent to that of their male counterparts. This practice seems to impede the performance of not just sustainability, but particularly regeneration in such traditions in Ghana. And thus, I call for regeneration because I realize that most of the males are now becoming old and the young ones are not ready to even assume such roles as master drummers. I therefore propose regenerative cultural policy rethinking that prioritizes gender inclusivity in all levels and aspects of cultural traditions like indigenous drumming practices. Regeneration, I think, goes beyond sustainability, and I frame these dynamics through the concept of regenerative cultural policy, which goes beyond the conventional sustainability focus on doing less harm and emphasizes the active restoration and improvement of cultural ecosystems like indigenous drumming, along with their social, economic, political, and environmental contexts. Sustainability, I think, works through linear systemic thinking, which is inadequate for current crisis, but because it leaves underlying value systems and power relations that negatively affect the outcomes of set goals. Regenerative in this presentation is a framework that aims to sustain all forms of life by working with living systems and whole systemic thinking, shifting attention from isolated sectors to interdependent ecological, social, economic, and cultural processes. It emphasizes holistic processes that recognize the interrelatedness of all elements in an environment and seek mutually beneficial feedback networks among physical, environmental, economic, cultural, social dynamics. The goal of such feedback networks is to rebuild interactions that are equitable, prosperous, and healthy, rather than simply less damaging or less unequal. This orientation demands new value systems and structural changes, including cultural policies that not only protect but actively revive and expand arts, cultural heritage, cultural practices, creative institutions so that they can catalyze regeneration in other domains of life. In this perspective, culture I define in this presentation from a broader sense as totality of the way of life evolved by our people through experience and reflection, and from also a narrow perspective as artistic representations and institutions. And these definitions are not passive heritage to be preserved, but a living system that can mediate regenerative processes across various domains of life, provided, and I mean provided, it is inclusive, reflexive, and structurally open to marginalized voices. To some scholars, culture regenerates when it is good culture. Therefore, I think regenerative cultural policies must prioritize not only the regeneration of culture itself, that is its preservation, invigoration, and promotion, or its role as an enabler of transformation in other sectors, but must advance gender inclusivity as a vital constituent of a regenerative approach. By regenerative cultural policy, I define it as an approach that supports cultural production and consumption in ways that restore and enhance cultural ecosystems and communities along with their natural, social, economic, and political context. Regenerative cultural policy, I think, restores and enhances systems thrives on holistic systemic thinking, and it is long-term. It leverages inclusivity to ensure the representation of everyone, women, marginalized genders, in participation, leadership, and decision making. I also think it supports gender-sensitive cultural content that challenges stereotypes, incorporates gender impact assessments into policy design, and promotes education and awareness on gender issues for cultural professionals. Such a cultural policy, I think, is concerned with restoring and then regenerating the capacity to live in a new ongoing relationships that benefits not just specific group or sectors, but also other public policy domains. It is intentionally process-oriented and holistic, and it aims to reshape asymmetrical relationships and practices through diverse participation, while rethinking top-down and bottom-up collaborative and co-creative dynamics to remove structural barriers and make marginalized actors visible and influential. Some scholars posit that policymaking is embedding multiple forms of knowledge, worldviews, and cultural imaginaries, including those that challenge the commodification of social relations and narrow growth-centered models of development. Evidence from broader cultural sectors also indicate that when gender-inclusive frameworks are adopted, cultural venues become more equitable and creative potential is expanded. And this is the method I used. I used a qualitative research method, and it is more like a longitudinal study which was initiated in 2019. But this part of the study is grounded in semi-structured interviews with 5 female master drummers conducted between September and November 2023, and I also participated in some of their performance practices. These participants are situated or found in regions in Ghana with rich traditional drumming practices in the middle and southern belts, while the studies treat drumming spaces as sites of power where issues of gender, power, agency, and cultural memory are actively negotiated rather than as neutral artistic spaces. 2 key theoretical frameworks underpinned the analysis. First, I looked at Stevenson's cultures framework that conceptualizes culture as cultural ensemble, which is constituted by what he terms motivators. And these motivators are the norms, the beliefs, the value systems, the language of a society. And these motivators actually drives activities, that is the habits, the rituals, the bodily practices that happens within society. And that actually inform the outcome, which Stevenson terms as materiality, which are the instruments, the spaces, the performances or artifacts. And these 3 ensemble or constituents of the cultural ensemble is actually informed by external influences, which are the institutions, the laws, and infrastructures. The idea is that policy outcomes shift when the underlying ensembles, that's cultural ensembles, transforms. So when motivators actually transform, or they actually transforms the activities within the spaces, then the outcome, which is the materiality, will also transform. I also leverage McPhill's feminist policy analysis to invoke or interrogate how values, power, language, and role definitions in policy text and implementation either reinforce or challenge gender inequalities. Together, these frameworks provide a good lens for linking textual policy analysis with lived experiences or practices. Before I move to discussing the 2004 cultural policy of Ghana vis-a-vis data from the field on female indigenous master dramas, I will give a brief history to the current cultural policy. That is the 2004 cultural policy. Ghana's 2004 cultural policy has its origin traced back to early post-colonial efforts aimed at preserving and promoting indigenous culture. Notably, Alex Yautrematin established a cultural center in Kumasi in 1951 and initiated the annual National Festival of Arts in 1956 with the backing of the Ashanti Council. Please, this actually is in the Ashanti region, specifically Kumasi. That is where Yautrematin actually initiated the cultural center, which now is called the Kumasi Cultural Center, and he had the backbone of the Asanteman culture. In fact, in Kumasi, the paramountcy or the chieftaincy paramountcy is called the Asanteman Council. So through his initiative, he created the first cultural center in Kumasi in 1951, and his main concern was to reduce acculturation. And in 1963, our first president, who is Kwame Nkrumah, nationalized this cultural center and renamed it the Ghana National Cultural Center. He integrated this cultural center into a broader unconstitutional cultural policy that aimed to highlight indigenous practices in state ceremonies, media, and the arts as part of a larger decolonization effort. Nkrumah's administration sought to formalize cultural policy with the establishment of the National Theatre Movement in 1955, but it couldn't succeed. His aim was to decolonize the African mind and revitalize Ghana's values, which actually has been devalued based on the colonial period and colonial events and practices that happened. However, the constitutional policy developed under the Arts Council during Nkrumah's period diverged from his intellectual and political vision of decolonizing the mind and decolonizing the then Ghanaian cultural values. So it failed to prioritize the social relevance of African arts or Ghanaian arts in education. Consequently, the policy initiated, stalled, and remained largely inactive until the 1980s, when the PNDC government, led by Jerry John Rawlings, revisited Nkrumah's ideas. This led to the formation of committees upon committees to rethink the framework, resulting in the creation of the National Commission on Culture in 1990, and ultimately the formal adoption of a revised constitution cultural policy in 2004 under President Ejikun Kufuor. The 2004 cultural policy of Ghana, which is currently under review, provides a critical site for examining how state frameworks can either sustain or challenge patriarchal structures in cultural practices. The REACH policy positions itself to protect, enhance, and promote Ghana's rich cultural heritage while integrating culture into national development. It draws on one concept, which is Sankofa, inspired vision that connects the past, present, and future. Sankofa means going to pick what is in the past, to use it in the present, to define the future. However, a gendered analysis of the policy reveals that while the 2004 policy claims to be nationally inclusive, it is rooted in the historical traditions and customs of Ghana's diverse ethnic groups, many of which are fundamentally patriarchal. So looking at the gendered analysis of the policy. First, this imbalance, that's the gendered imbalance, is clear in governance structures. The first board, for example, of the National Commission on Culture consisted of 3 women, 3 and 13 men. Also, both the executive director and deputy director have been male, and 14 out of 16 regional directors of centers for national culture are men. In fact, we have 16 regions, and each region has a center for national culture, and their mother board is the National Commission on Culture. And these 16 centers for national culture, 14 of these 16 has males as their directors. Even the current policy review committee is predominantly male, with 17 men and 3 women. These patterns indicate that decisions regarding cultural priorities, resources, recognitions may be largely influenced by male perspectives, leaving little institutional space for female practitioners, including drummers, to influence policy directions. Secondly, customary systems typically assign leadership and public roles to men, relegating women to supportive or domestic positions. This creates a gendered division of labor and authority that affects formal policy structures. In a cultural policy, chiefs are mandated to support in the implementation of the policy. That is good. The figure chief, in fact, encapsulates contradiction. Officially, the term is framed as a neutral designation for a leader of a traditional council. So whether the person is a man or a woman, the person is supposed to be called a chief. However, in practice, it refers predominantly to men in roles within traditional councils, regional houses of chiefs, and the National House of Chiefs. As one chief explains, the Queen Mother nominates and advises the chief, maintaining a separate line of authority, yet her role is defined as complementary rather than equal. This distinction subtly but powerfully nominalized male leadership as the standard. So if you come to the indigenous chieftaincy institutions in Ghana, when you hear the term chief, in constitution, it means anyone, so a male or a female. But when it comes to the practical terms, when you hear the term chief, everyone knows it's a male. So no one will think of a chief as a female. Even when some male figures are labeled as pro-feminist, there is a concern that empowering women, especially queen mothers, in formal leadership roles would undermine hegemonic masculinity. This anxiety arises from deeply ingrained beliefs about the naturalness and superiority of male dominance, which are reinforced by the patriarchal socialization experienced by men in Ghana and further complicated by colonial distortions of gender relations. This tension is particularly evident when comparing the policy normative language to its institutional arrangements. For example, Target 4.4.1 in the policy states that the cultural policy aims to serve the entire population, ensuring that all individuals and social groups can access and participate in cultural events, while eliminating discrimination based on ethnicity, gender, religion, economic status, age, or disability. However, this seemingly inclusive commitment is undermined by decision-making structures and terminologies that consistently prioritize male leadership. This discrepancy highlights the gap between the policy's egalitarian aspirations and the gendered realities of its implementation. let's look at language choice. With language choices, the policy appears to adopt gender-neutral terminologies like chief, which according to constitutional guidelines is anyone installed as a chief or queen mother. However, in practice, chiefs who collaborate with the National Commission on Culture in planning and implementing the cultural policy are predominantly male traditional leaders, while queen mothers exist in parallel but subordinate structure, holding advisory rather than equal authority. This creates a facade of neutrality that obscures a deeply gendered reality, where men hold central positions in heritage preservation and cultural governance, while women's leadership is symbolically acknowledged but structurally limited. Again, the policy frequently concepts defaults to masculine generics such as craftsmen, actors, and nothing like craft women or actresses. In drumming practices, men are drummers or master drummers, whereas women are marked as female drummers, signifying deviation from a masculine norm. Female master drummers testify that despite teaching male colleagues and leading ensembles, they are addressed by personal names rather than titles, and alternative labels such as mistress drummers are dismissed as odd and never adopted. Such lexicons are not trivial. They signal whose expertise counts and whose presence is viewed as exceptional, thereby limiting the discursive space for women to be imagined as cultural authorities. So juxtaposing the drumming space with policy, I realized that in practice, indigenous drumming spaces is a locale of power. In most male-dominated drumming contexts, women encounter formal and informal restrictions that confine them to supporting or peripheral roles rather than allowing them to access to the central spiritually significant positions where master drummers perform. This was confirmed in the findings where men were by default permitted to drum in sacred and secular spaces, but women are restricted to the latter. One reason given is that women may unknowingly desecrate sacred spaces which house gods, spirits, and ancestors when they are menstruating. Such restrictions hardly favor women to occupy prominent positions as lead performers, composers, and instrumentalists even when they reach menopause. Despite efforts of participants to increase female representation in indigenous drumming in Ghana, females are still underrepresented as drummers because males control the space. They control who performs what instruments. Even where both genders are admitted to a space, the males are given priority to lead the drumming because they are seen as the master drummers who have the expertise, while the females are seen as merely drummers even when they have same expertise. This also means females hardly receive training and resources compared to their male counterparts. In many communities, apprenticeships in drum playing, that's the traditional pathway to mastery, are controlled by male elders and typically reserved for male youth or offered on equal terms to girls. Women may lack access to high-quality drums or face expectation that they should prioritize domestic labor over extended training periods. Leadership positions within drumming ensembles and cultural organizations are similarly restricted as decision-making roles remain predominantly male-held. Even when a woman owns an ensemble, she prefers a man to be in charge than a woman. This multi-layered exclusion from consistent training and resources necessary for one's advancement in indigenous drumming creates a cycle in which women are fewer in number, less in publicly visible as accomplished drummers, and therefore less likely to be considered as mentors, leaders, or representatives in policy and cultural discussions. Despite these pervasive and systematic barriers, there are emerging social and institutional dynamics that are beginning to expand the participation and visibility of women in indigenous Ghanaian drumming traditions as drummers. Though very slow, these shifts represent both grassroots drive and structural openings that could be leveraged by deliberate policy intervention. One primary driver of change is the combined effort of urbanization, creation of more secular cultural centers, and the expansion of education, particularly through school-based drumming programs. As young people migrate to urban centers and interact with cultural centers and educational systems, increasingly incorporates indigenous drumming into their curricula, traditional barriers related to space and cultural inhibitions are beginning to diminish. Urban environments characterized by greater secularization and a more relaxed adherence to traditions and customs offer girls more opportunities to access drumming training. Additionally, school presents drumming as a formal subject rather than a practice strictly governed by male elders, thereby opening pathways for girls that are previously closed off. This institutional recognition of drumming within cultural centers is also promoting a new generation of female practitioners who have gained expertise and technical skills within and outside of male-dominated apprenticeship systems. The second significant shift is the rise of female master drummers who are actively mentoring and training younger generations of both boys and girls, one aspect or one driver of regeneration. These women not only demonstrate that female excellence in drumming is achievable, but they also serve as role models of professional identity and agency within the field. Notably, several of these practitioners aim to establish their own academies, indicating their intention to formalize and institutionalize female-centered training structures rather than remain in ad hoc or supplementary roles. This represents a move towards what can be described as regenerative capacity building, where women create the institutional and pedagogical infrastructure that previous generations lacked, thereby transforming the conditions under which drumming knowledge is transmitted and validated. However, progress in gender inclusion is uneven across Ghana's geographical regions. The northern regions continue to maintain stricter gender norms that constrain female participation more rigidly than in the middle and southern belts, where the research was conducted. This geographic disparity suggests that while urbanization and educational expansion are creating openings, they are not uniformly distributed, and that deep-rooted customary practices and regional variations in patriarchal intensity persist as cultural barriers in some contexts. The implication is that any national cultural policy seeking to advance women's inclusion must probably be sensitive to these regional differences and avoid a one-size-fits-all approach that ignores local specificities and resistance. These shifts, that's urbanization-driven access, upsurge and impacts of cultural centers and institutional visions of female drummers, indicate that change is already underway from bottom up. The question, however, is, without deliberate policy support and structural intervention, how sustainable and how far-reaching can these grassroots momentums alone become? The answer suggests a conscious reimagining of cultural policy frameworks, constitutional and even unconstitutional ones. This brings us to the thrust of this presentation or this paper towards regenerative gender inclusive cultural policy. Given that Ghana's cultural policy is currently under review, the paper positions this moment as a critical opportunity to reorient the framework towards gender inclusive regeneration. This proposed framework combines top-down and bottom-up approaches, beginning with restructuring the Policy Review Committee to ensure equitable gender representation and requiring members to engage seriously with contemporary gender research in cultural policy and practice in Ghana. Broader stakeholder engagement is also essential. Performers, cultural management in cultural institutions, academics and community leaders, and even representatives of both formal and informal cultural spaces should be involved, increasing identification with policy and improving prospects for implementation. At the level of policy content, the paper advocates for a new vision that explicitly foregrounds diversity in regeneration and acknowledges the interdependence of cultural, social, environmental, and economic systems. Objectives should commit to promoting, preserving, regenerating, and documenting cultural heritage without discrimination and prejudice, with specific attention to indigenous drumming practices, performance spaces, and instrumentation. This involves removing language that implies the dominance of any group, revising gender terms, and introducing programs that encourage equitable participation, including support for individuals, group, and community-led initiatives by women and other marginalized actors. Under implementation, transforming policy text into lived change requires careful attention to implementation and monitoring. Pre-implementation measures should include gender-sensitive training for cultural stakeholders and legislators, pilot testing proposed reforms to drive acceptance. It is important to put in place strong consultation mechanisms to ensure that women drummers and other marginalized practitioners have inputs before final policies are adopted. During implementation, ongoing training and awareness raising for implementers, gender diverse governance structures across cultural bodies, and monitoring and evaluation systems that track policy impact on gender inclusion are critical. This is to be supported by feedback loops that allow for adaptive management. For example, female master drummers emerge in this analysis not as passive victims but as agents of change and key partners in regeneration. Some already train mixed gender cohorts and aspire to establish academies to mentor young generations, particularly girls, thereby expanding the pipeline of skilled practitioners and challenging assumptions about who can own and lead ensembles. Their ambitions and existing initiatives demonstrate that when barriers are reduced, women do not simply fill existing roles, but actively innovate in pedagogy, ensemble organization, and community outreach to enrich the cultural spaces and activities. In conclusion, I realized that the combined evidence from policy analysis and ethnographic engagements shows that gender inequality in indigenous drumming is real, complex, and deeply embedded in Ghana's cultural infrastructure. One of the central insights of the phenomenon in this presentation is that cultural policy and drumming practices form a mutually reinforcing system of gender imbalance. At the level of representation, male-dominated boards and committees produce policies that reflect male experiences and priorities, while the underrepresentation and marginalization of female drummers in practice ensure that women's perspectives remain largely invisible to policymakers. This cyclical relationship extends to roles. Policy language and program contents implicitly imagine women in limited supportive capacities, while practice mirrors this by directing women into secondary tasks, prompting them to cultivate workaround strategies that over time become normalized rather than recognized as responses to exclusion. Language operates as a key connector in this symbiosis. Gendered lexicons in official documents legitimize male-centered categories, which are then reproduced in ensembles and cultural groups, shaping how instruments, roles, and hierarchies are named. These mutually reinforcing patterns undermine knowledge transmission by confining women's expertise to informal or hidden circuits, diminishing the diversity of creative voices and threatening the long-term sustainability of drumming traditions. In this sense, gender inequity is not just unjust. It actively blocks cultural regeneration by narrowing who can inherit, interpret, and pass on drumming lineages. The call for gender inclusivity framed through a regenerative cultural policy lens is not a peripheral concern, but a central condition for vibrant, sustainable, and adaptable cultural spaces and practices in which drumming traditions can evolve without sacrificing their integrity. Regenerative cultural policy, then, is both an analytical framework and a practical roadmap. It calls for revising governance structures, reworking policy language, investing in education and training, and centering the expertise of female master drummers and other marginalized practitioners in decisions about cultural futures. Finally, culture regenerates when it is good culture, and good culture is that which includes all voices, reflects multiple experiences, and leverages diversity as a source of strength rather than a threat. Thank you.
I can start us off, perhaps take some chair's privilege to ask you a little bit about when you speak of sort of the implementation of cultural policy, and you mentioned a little that there were national councils and different bodies involved. Could you, for those of us who aren't familiar with the Ghanaian context, sort of what are the different kind of levels and layers of cultural policy in Ghana where it would be key to see this type of implementation of a regenerative approach?
Okay. In Ghana, the cultural policy is implemented by the National Commission on Culture. That is the mother commission for implementing the cultural policy. But the commission is actually given the chance to now bring in pro-cultural institutions to support its implementation. And one main pro-cultural institution is a chieftaincy institution, which is actually ruled by males. So the chiefs come in, and that is because they are assumed to be the repository of knowledge of our culture. So they support the National Commission on Culture to implement the cultural policy. Besides, there are other pro-cultural institutions like schools, cultural institutions like the Center for National Culture, which is actually within all the 16 regions in Ghana. We have centers for national culture within all the 16 regions in Ghana. Apart from that, we have district center for national culture within the districts in the regions. So these cultural institutions are actually driving the implementation of the policy. But interestingly, these institutions are more male dominated than females.
Thank you, Madinatu. Yeah, it's really interesting to know sort of the different kind of groups that would need to be kind of engaged with this type of policy. You say perhaps some of the challenges if you're dealing with the sort of the chiefs group in trying to get that kind of power dynamic to be shifted in the language of policy
Yes,
as well.
yes, there is this power dynamics in that even within the chieftaincy institution, the queen mother, though install the chief, but the queen mother doesn't have that power to decide what the chief actually does within the community. Though the queen mother installs the chief. And that has actually transcended up to the national level, whereby we have the National House of Chiefs. But there, we don't have any queen mother in there. So whatever the queen mother wants to actually push forward should be liaised through the chiefs, and who actually decide what actually should be said at the end of the day. So here there is this kind of gender disparities playing out, which actually limits the woman from coming, or even limits inputs that will actually favor the woman and remove certain stereotypes that are against the woman when it comes to these cultural um, aspects within the larger societal group. In fact, it's not only within the indigenous drumming ecosystem. It cuts across most of the cultural spaces within the Ghanaian context.
Yeah, I think that touches on Roberta's question I see in the chat about how much this is, whether this is unique to drumming or a broader sense of these dynamics playing out in the creative industries. I don't suppose, are there other sort of forms of creative practice that are more like led by women, that maybe show a different dynamic, that maybe they've traditionally always been led by women, so perhaps showing something different?
Yes, within the broader cultural and creative industry, a similar thing is happening. Let's take the cultural institutions like the performing arts institutions within the universities. It is hardly for a woman to assume leadership position within these institutions. In fact, most of the leaders are males. But it's also interesting to say that a lot of those who pass through these performing arts education are women, but they hardly assume these leadership positions. Coming to the creative sector, you realize that most of the creative arts institutions are owned by males. The few ones owned by females at times are even given over to males to manage, while the female is at the periphery. So in most cases, there is this issue of hegemonic masculinity playing out, and that's even actually stemmed from our larger societal practices, which is a matrilineal form of inheritance, which gives power to the woman to rule. But at the end of the day, it is the man who is ruling in place of the woman. For example, if my mother is practicing the matrilineal system of inheritance, at the end of the day, he will ask my uncle to give me out in marriage. She cannot do it, though she is leading the family, but she doesn't have the right to give me out to marriage. And this has transcended into these cultural spaces. So much so that females hardly had the opportunity to lead. So they are always being led in the creative industries, in most of the creative industries, even with the indigenous drumming groups that I actually explored. The males are being managed by their husbands or by other males. They don't manage themselves. And some of the females also give out the ensemble to the male managers to manage. So they come in to perform and leave. So the society, the larger society, and practices within the larger society always inform what is happening within these spaces. That's the cultural and creative industry.
Thank you. Could perhaps continue on that line with Jen's question, which is about how these women drummers, as you mentioned, like the leadership or the kind of the agents are still the men. The control of the sector is still by the men, but these women are gaining in influence, in visibility, and in hopefully in status through kind of that steady incremental work of kind of pushing those barriers. Jen has asked, how much is it supported really by the chiefs or the other men in the sector? Like, is it really supported? Is there kind of contest there? And also what the audiences might think about seeing these women performing in this traditionally male kind of performance space.
Okay, from the data I collected, I realized that most of these women master drummers were supported by chiefs. Either they are their uncles, their fathers, or their brothers. So they having these supports, they are able to now break the wall to enter into the center to drum. So in with all the participants I interviewed, about 80% of them were supported by their uncles and their fathers who were chiefs in the society. So it wasn't difficult for them to enter the space. It was only one person who was supported by the husband to actually move into the space. So you can see that the males are now becoming the supporters to actually advance this discourse. But interestingly, as they move into the larger societal space to perform, now other chiefs actually are interested in whatever they are doing and they are willing to also embrace them. But it is worth stating that they are willing to support them to drum within the secular spaces only, not the sacred spaces. So all sacred spaces are prohibited to the woman. They can drum at during festivals, derbes, marriage ceremonies, funeral ceremonies, naming ceremonies, other engagement ceremonies or parties or whatever it is. But when it comes to the conduction of rituals associated with the chieftaincy institution, they are out. They are not made to actually engage in this drumming. So the audiences are now also patronizing the females in that they are now seeing a new trend. A lot of us did not even know that women will be given the chance to interact with the drums. For example, when I was growing, I was made to understand that I can only sing, dance, and clap. Until I got to the university and I saw a female, a woman teaching drumming, I was surprised. And likewise, the male students were also surprised because a woman shouldn't interact with the drum. But now they are realizing that the women are now defying these what they term myth and legends associated with the drum, because the social controls that men were using were that if the female drums, she will become barren. She can't get anyone to marry. There is a possibility of death. So the females now retreated. But now the males are now saying that they were all more of myth. But I would say that until the females enter the sacred spaces and defy those supposed social controls, it will be difficult to say that they are myth. That's my opinion, because they are now made to drum, but drum within secular spaces, which actually have less of these spiritual connotations and what have you. What about they being allowed to enter the sacred spaces? And let us see whether those were myth or they were actually facts.
Fascinating. Thank you. It's really interesting to sort of think about from the that really embedded kind of social, spiritual, and creative kind of dynamic that plays out in this practice of drumming. It's a real kind of microcosm for understanding kind of the societal kind of tensions, evolution, the sort of changing role of women, perception of women, the sort of strategies that they're using along the way. Roberta has another question. Sort of speak, as you've just mentioned, how embedded drumming is in sort of local communities, local culture, and national culture in Ghana, but elsewhere on the continent. She said, I wonder whether international or global connections somehow help women emerge in this space, or whether the gender dynamics are also present internationally when they're performing outside of Ghana.
From my interaction, I realized that it is easier when the women actually move into the global space. One of them actually had been teaching in universities in Europe and in the Americas for a long period of time, and they accepted her to teach and to drum. But when she came to Ghana, it was actually difficult for her to be allowed to partake in these drum spaces. So I sort of realized that outside Ghana, the shores or beyond Ghana actually supported these women to actually move up to be what they are today. Unlike our indigenous spaces, which are actually forced with these social controls and which actually create some kind of inhibitions for them to move forward. Though some are actually struggling hard to break these barriers. In fact, they are ready to, and they are actually doing that. But it is more national stage, and they have that kind of liberty to express themselves. What I want to also add is that now the entire society, a larger part of the society is now embracing these women into drumming, in that the women said that they now even get more chances to play at events more than even the males, which in a way is also creating some kind of tension because the males are assuming that they are now taking over their space and their position in the society, because now even a lot of chiefs would like females to drum in their events. A lot of males are ready to call on them to be part of their ceremonies than even call on the males to be part of their ceremonies. But still, there are some conservative males who actually are against them. In that, one of the participants indicated that once she went for a funeral and the time she started drumming, a man came in and just pulled the drumsticks away from her and told her that she's not supposed to be the drummer for the ceremony. And she said she was actually paid to drum for the ceremony, but the man actually was not ready to accept that, to the extent that she said, whether it is true or not, she experienced some kind of sickness after the interaction between her and the man. As to whether that was the cause, that's one I will not be in the best position to actually talk about. But there are still inhibitions, though dynamic is changing with time, because now some of the women are creating schools to train boys and girls. Others are also training their daughters to drum. So it's like they've come to understand the need to actually drive this regeneration within the ecosystem.
Thank you. It's really fantastic discussion. As you see, is a very kind of a space of great tension, but also of a very interesting kind of change and sort of these women kind of navigating this space. In your wider work, you've spoken about the kind of the strategic ways in which they do that. I wonder if you could touch a little bit more on sort of those strategies that you've seen by women, sort of how to navigate some of these kind of structural and social barriers that they've come up against.
Yes, some adopt the lobbying strategy. They lobby, and they lobby through their male counterparts. So what one female does is that when they go for a program or to perform for a program, she will just stay back and wait for the males to drum up to how long they wish to. When they are tired, they will come and call her, and that is when she takes over, and the whole crowd is just over her. At times, too, what she does is that she will allow them. In fact, people will throw money on her. She would allow the males to take the money, because as they are taking the money, she is drumming. So she's okay with that. And that paves way for her to actually assume the position of a master drummer in most of the events that they go. Some are also use this passive aggressive form. In fact, they 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 they, they confront their male counterparts head on, and try to reason through with them that they are partners in driving the ecosystem. So they should accept them. They shouldn't think that they are coming to push them off the space. They are coming to support them so that they will be able to keep the ecosystem going. So at times they are passive aggressive in some cases. Yeah. And at times some are use the withdrawal system. They would withdraw from the space and leave everything to the males. So when the males do whatever they want to do and they leave the space, then she will come in to also take her position to drum. So there are some strategies that they use, but in most cases they rely on the males to actually assume the position that they want to.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear about both the direct and indirect approaches that they're taking. I suppose in linking that through to then like the policy space, I suppose, is it that you would like to see, with the implementation of a regenerative cultural policy that adopts a more gender inclusive language, that you would perhaps negate the need for some of these kind of, either the need for the confrontation because it would be legitimized that they should be in that space, and also the need to kind of give up your funds or wait and stay at the back to be able to do that. So is your hope, so if you could adopt this in a more sort of formal policy space, that it would kind of pave the way for sort of a slightly more open practice?
I don't think it will just happen at once. And I think it will start from somewhere, and it has started. Now, the society is trying to accept them into the space, though there are some hindrances. And I'm proposing for a gender restructuring to be more gender inclusive. And again, I'm proposing that gender inclusivity like should not only look at the females but other stakeholders within the space and within the practice, so that as the policy actually drives the implementation or the practice, and the practice also inform the content of the policy. So there is this symbiotic relationship between these two. So therefore, I am thinking that once the policy is able to restructure and to create spaces for all these gender inclusivity among others, it will now filter through to the practice sector, which will inform practice gradually. I'm not advocating for just a bomb, but a gradual change within the space. And though it is slow, I have to be honest, it is very slow, because for a 2-year research I've done, I've been able to only assess 5 female Indigenous master drummers. Only 5. The whole of Ghana. So I know it is slow, but as it has started and the females are also devising strategies to actually open up to bring in more females and more young males to actually come into the ecosystem, I think gradually that idea of gender um, di- di- gender stereotyping and what have you will gradually fade out. And also educational institution actually also have to come in, because it is important that change can erupt from the educational institution when males will now accept females as partners in drumming, because that's more of a secular space which actually will open up for the females to come in. In fact, what I would say is that the Centers for National Culture are now opening up for the women to come in bit by bit, because I had an interaction with some of them, the males in there, and they say that there are certain times they get to perform and they realize that some of their males are not in. So they fall on the females to support them. So they are gradually accepting the females into that space, which I think will also filter into the larger society, because the Centers for National Culture actually have direct contact with the society, because they feed the society with these cultural practices. Like they interact with more with the society in terms of these cultural practices. So I think that space also could be one avenue to driving these inclusivity and regeneration in the indigenous drumming space.
Okay, I think it's great, important to, as you say, like there are five in all of Ghana. You've been able to find five so far, so
Yes.
that pace is so. But it shows that potential, as you say, with education, with strategy, like with support from the councils to kind of normalize and mainstream kind of women in that space. And then hopefully that would also, I suppose, feed into a sort of a more kind of democratization, perhaps, of access to the drumming. You mentioned a lot of these women, they are the sisters, the relatives of the chiefs, of people in power, which, so obviously they come from a kind of a high status position themselves. So by having a sort of, they are kind of showing the way, and then hopefully perhaps through the education, those
Yeah.
opportunities might be opened up to sort of wider kind of groups in society. Is that something you think would sort of be an outcome also of the sort of an investment in
Yes.
education?
Yes, I think, because if I look at the current crop of master drummers, female master drummers, they were, and some males within the society. So I think that if we have more of these chiefs actually supporting females, because they are the custodians of these cultural ensembles, actually. So if they accept, then ultimately those within the society will accept, because our leaders are accepting it, then it is high time we change to accept. So yes, that is a good drive. The chiefs are doing well, but it is also important to state that there are politics playing out within these spaces. Some chiefs will not accept, because when the female they accept that way, then it means that their ensembles will be collapsing, because now the society will be taking will be advocating for the women to give them more of their performances than the males. So in other words, the chiefs who own ensembles led by males will also be disadvantaged. So there is this politics actually playing in there. Some chiefs are not willing to, but other chiefs are also willing to support. Likewise, some females are not willing to support the females to become master drummers. That's also there, because they also own ensembles led by males. And if the females are taking over the space, then it means their ensembles are going to collapse. So politics is also playing its part or its role within the space.
Thank you. I don't think we have any other questions coming through in the chat. If anyone does have a final question they would like to ask, so I'll ask you, please do let us know. Give that a moment. Otherwise, Madinatu, is there anything else, building on your previous work, or what's coming next for you in terms of, are you planning to continue this work? Do you have other avenues you want to explore with the drummers?
Yes. Currently, I want to explore these female drummers and their practices within museums. So as entrepreneurs within museums in Ghana. So that is where I'm also looking at, because these museums are also cultural spaces that create limitations and advance this issue of stereotyping and what have you. So what are these females also moving in there to actually, what change are they going to cause in there? So that's one area I'm exploring right now currently.
So look at so that wider kind of institutional ecosystem that they're part of. That sounds great. So, well, we'll look forward to hearing more about that part of your work as it develops. And thank you once again. It's a real pleasure to hear your talk. You know, doing that deep dive into gender and cultural regeneration in Indigenous drumming in Ghana. Thank you very much again. So we've got some fantastic coming in from the audience. So yes, please give our thanks to Madinatu. As I mentioned, you've got the book chapter coming out in the African Urban Creativity book, which will be published midway through September. So please do keep an eye out for that. Madinatu is one of our fantastic contributors with the work on that kind of those strategic kind of practices by the women Indigenous drummers being kind of the central focus of that chapter. So it's wonderful to get this wider piece of reflection and hear about what you'd like to be working on next. Hopefully when that work done, perhaps we'll have you back again for another seminar.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
That's it. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Please do keep an eye out for the announcements of future research seminars, and yeah, keep in touch with the core activities on all of the website and social media.